Marx, as you know, rejected what is called Say's law, which basically says that supply creates its own demand. Therefore, there is never a problem of deficiency of aggregate demand. But I think while working his reproduction schemes, I think his concern was really much more to show how exactly the process of circulation of commodities occurs, not necessarily to claim that actually this is the way that things happen in capitalism, because the reproduction schemes are fundamentally based on the assumption that Say's law is valid. But in fact, that is something which Marx rejected throughout his writings. So I think we should not take his picture of expanded reproduction as a realistic picture of how things happen under capitalism. The current inflation was actually stimulated by the rise in profit margins.
Yes.
I believe the rise in profit margins was in fact facilitated by the floating of this enormous amounts of liquidity in most capitalist economies, which really greatly reduced the liquidity risks. Because, if a firm decides to raise profit margins, it would be handicapped if there are serious illiquidity risks that it will have to face. But the availability of this enormous amounts of liquidity and virtually at zero interest rates is something that actually reduced illiquidity risks to a point where many of the corporations felt emboldened to push up their profit margins. And I think that was the beginning of the inflation, in order to curb which now the governments all over the capitalist world are actually raising interest rates and so on. In the US, they say federal funds rate may have to be raised up to 6%. So that is going to push the world economy into a serious recession. In the colonial period, the world economy was segmented. That labor from the global south was not allowed to move to the global north. It still is not allowed to move freely. And capital from the global north, even though it was allowed legally to move to the global south, didn't actually do so. So the point is that now that second part is no longer true, that capital from the global north, at least for certain kinds of activities, is moving to global south. Now, one would have thought that this would therefore use up the labor reserves which are there in the global south, which are a legacy of colonialism, deindustrialization historically carried out. So the shift in income distribution also has the effect in reducing employment, and of course the very high rates of labor productivity growth. Therefore, the growth of employment in many countries, I know this is true of India, the growth of employment is simply even less than the natural rate of growth of the workforce, let alone absorbing the labor reserves. And what is more, the labor reserves are also getting replenished because under neoliberalism, there is necessarily an attack on petty producers and peasants. The whole idea is to open that entire sector for encroachment by capital. You see, when Lenin was talking about worker-peasant alliance, the basis of that alliance lay in the fact that the workers would usher in a democratic revolution against the feudal lords, and that would free the peasants. So, but then after the peasants are freed from the clutches of feudal lords, then of course the basis in that sense of the worker-peasant alliance no longer exists. Certainly not between the peasantry as a whole and the workers. Now we live in a very different world where the basis for a worker-peasant alliance is really much firmer, because both are now confronting globalized capital. So there's no question of the peasantry developing, the rich peasant, the kulaks developing, becoming a capitalist threat to a socialist order and so on, because of the fact that they cannot develop as a capitalist class if the economy is open to encroachment by international agribusiness and so on, which would like to keep them under its control. So that actually puts a constraint on the development of indigenous capitalism from among the rich peasant class and so on the other hand, to the extent they are squeezed, they have a real interest in making common cause with the industrial workers. In other words, the basis for a worker-peasant alliance today is stronger than at any time from Lenin's days. Neo-fascism is neoliberalism's answer. They form an alliance with neo-fascism, answer to possible working-class militancy. The militancy that you're currently witnessing in large parts of Europe, and a militancy which can threaten at any time, even in the global south. I think what the Ukraine war suggests is certainly an immense crisis for global capitalism. Neoliberalism imposed upon the world an order that was really an imperialist order, because it opened up all countries to the penetration of metropolitan capital. The point is that I believe that because of the crisis of neoliberalism, and when you have that kind of a threat, then the efforts to control that threat actually further accentuate the crisis. What is happening in Europe is of great interest to the entire world, and also to the future of capitalism. I am not saying that the workers are engaged in a socialist struggle. The workers are engaged in an economic struggle, but that economic struggle within the parameters of capitalism is really not going to be very successful. So the point to see is, what do the workers do next? Obviously then political issues would come onto the agenda. And I believe, once the European workers are on the path of strikes and actions and so on, this has a great impact on the global south as well.
Yes.
So I believe generally that we are entering a period of struggles.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Patnaik.